Between the Covers is brought to you in part through the support of Propeller, a magazine of books, music, art, film, and life, and its publishing imprint, Propeller Books. Visit them on the web at propellermag.com and propellerbooks.com or on Twitter at propellermag. Coming up next is the 103rd episode of Between the Covers, a conversation with National Book Award finalist Carmen Maria Machado. But before we start, I want to alert you to some new things about the show. Between the Covers is still a listener-supported labor of love. You can still go to patreon.com/betweenthecovers and support the show. You will see there that you can still get a copy of Jesse Ball's fantastic co-written out-of-print book, Vera and Linus, as a reward. But also, since the beginning of 2018, I'm gathering and offering bonus material that the guests record once the conversation is over. Today, it is Carmen Maria Machado reading two pieces, a story called Miss Laura's School for Esquire Men and her essay, How I Should Have Known Trump Would Be Elected President. These join Yeonsong Kim's prose poems from her upcoming novella and Lainey Zumis's reading of her essay, Voss, Brief, and Light, in the growing bonus material archive. So check it out at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. I also want to just take a moment in honor of and in memory of Ursula K. Le Guin. She was a guest on the program 3 times for poetry, fiction, and nonfiction. She was a tireless supporter of community radio, and we were in the final stages together of proofreading the manuscript of a book we were making together when I got the news that she had died. Not having really the words to say what she means to me or to be able to describe the importance she had to literature at large, I've been reading a lot of tributes, wonderful tributes by David Mitchell, by Neil Gaiman, by Margaret Atwood. But if I were to point you to one that I found particularly moving, it was the tribute by a past Between the Covers guest and science fiction luminary in her own right, Jo Walton. So I hope you'll seek out Jo Walton's words, and rest in peace and rest in power, Ursula K. Le Guin. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest is fiction writer, critic, and essayist Carmen Maria Machado, a graduate of both the Iowa Writers Workshop and the Clarion Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Workshop. Machado's work has appeared both in The New Yorker, Tin House, Granta, and Agni, as well as Strange Horizons, Lightspeed, Nightmare Magazine, and the Fairy Tale Review. Her work has been anthologized in Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy, Grave Predictions, Tales of Mankind's Post-Apocalyptic Dystopian and Disastrous Destiny, Latino Rising, a Latino anthology of science fiction and fantasy, Best Horror of the Year, Year's Best Weird Fiction, Best Women's Erotica, and Mothership, Tales of Afro-Futurism and Beyond. Machado's work has been nominated for a Nebula and Shirley Jackson Award, a finalist for the Calvino Prize, and longlisted for the Tiptree Award. Carmen Maria Machado is currently the artist in residence at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia and is here today to talk about one of the most heralded short story collections of 2017, Her Body and Other Parties, out from Grey Wolf Press. Receiving the coveted starred review from both Publishers Weekly and Kirkus, Her Body and Other Parties is the winner of the National Book Critics Circle John Leonard Prize for Best First Book, a finalist for the National Book Award in Fiction, winner of the Bard Fiction Prize, and longlisted for the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize for Debut Fiction. Karen Russell says of Her Body and Other Parties, Machado tells ancient tales of eros and female metamorphosis in fantastically new ways, giving literal shape to women's memories and hunger and desire. Roxane Gay adds that these stories vibrate with originality, queerness, sensuality, and the strange. Jeff Vandermeer calls this collection genius, part punk rock, part classical, with stories that are raw and devastating, but also exquisitely plotted and full of delight. And Bennett Sims says of Machado writes uncanny, creepy, sexy, funny, feminist, magical realist, metafictional, pop cultural, and all of the above stories, and she seems determined never to write the same story twice. Yet for all of its wildly inventive variety, her body and other parties is unified by the one story it keeps finding new ways to tell: how women can survive in worlds that want them to disappear, whether into marriage, motherhood, death, or literally prom dresses. Welcome to Between the Covers, Carmen Maria Machado.
Thank you for having me.
So I'd like to start with a discussion of the uncanny, but specifically the uncanny as it relates to gender. When you've been asked this question, why women writers seem to turn to the uncanny, and I think of writers, say, like Kelly Link or Helen Oyeyemi or Karen Russell, you've given several interesting answers. One of them is around the value of women's work, that because women's work is generally devalued, a realistic story about sexual assault written by a woman is more easily and readily dismissed than a story that takes the same concerns into the world of the fantastic. And you mentioned the last story in your collection, Difficult at Parties, as an example of you doing this, and also as the beginning of you writing in this way more generally. So I was hoping you could elaborate about the phenomenon in general around women and realism, and then more specifically maybe walk us through a little bit about a story like Difficult at Parties and taking real world concerns and bringing them into the world of the uncanny.
Yeah, so there's a really tremendous essay by Freud about the uncanny. I don't know if you're familiar with it, that I teach. And he sort of takes some stories and kind of retroactively sort of tries to come up with a definition of the uncanny. And one of the things he talks about is the sensation of if you, so he's if there's a certain number that shows up, you might think nothing of it. If you see the number 23 and you're like, whatever. But then if you check into a hotel and it's number 23, the number on the door is 23, then you catch a bus and it's number 23, and the number 23 keeps sort of showing up. Eventually there's this sense of, what he calls the uncanny, right? And similarly, he sort of talks about if there's, if you're walking through a city and you suddenly find yourself back where you started and you don't exactly know how you got there, that also is that sense, the sort of dreamlike sense of the uncanny. And I feel like there's something about being a woman and writing as a woman and that sense of I know this, I know what is coming, I already recognize this, even though it's never happened to me exactly this way before. That I think is I think it's probably true of a lot of different groups of people, but I think with women especially, there's something about our experiences that reflect that quality. So when I started writing Difficult at Parties, which is a story about a woman who is sort of recovering from an act of sexual violence and is sort of struggling to kind of reclaim her body and reclaim her interiority, and just trying to have sex with her boyfriend and is not exactly succeeding. And then she decides to try some porn, see if that will help. And when she watches the porn video, she begins to hear the voices of the actors in the porn film, which actually becomes the way that she sort of begins to sort of access her interiority again at the end of the story. I was in this place in my career. I was pretty young. I was in grad school, and I'd been writing a lot of stories that weren't really working. My classmates were lovely and kind and supportive, but were basically like, this is not great. But there's certain moments in here that are really sparking, and the moments I always seem to recognize were these moments where reality was getting punctured a little bit, and the story was changing. It was sort of, you could tell it was shifting modes a little bit, even though it was very small. So I had this truly dreadful story whose plot is completely irrelevant, and I'm gonna, humiliate myself by explaining it. But there was a scene where death appears to this woman and is talking to her, and everyone was like, most of the story is pretty forgettable, but that moment is really interesting, and it seems like you're really interested in that sort of, liminal space. And then I started reading people like Karen Russell, Kelly Link, George Saunders, et cetera, Helen Oyeyemi, and I sort of found myself recognizing like the sheer power of like just taking from what you want from genres, and like how there's sort of this thing that they're able to give you, where you can sort of revisit material that is familiar, but in ways that are so strange that like it feels really fresh and really new and really different. And so, yeah, and then I began to write, I had been thinking about writing a story about sexual violence, but I was so worried because I was like, I feel like people will be like, oh, another rape story by some woman. You know what I mean? Like that fear and that anxiety. And so I was like, well, okay, like how do I write? So I just started writing. I mean, I didn't sort of know that's what I was going to write about exactly, but I sort of wrote about this woman, and I was thinking about, the way she was sort of very cold, it's not the right word, but she just felt very distant, and she was having trouble kind of accessing something inside of her. And then I sort of loved this idea, and that I was sort of thinking about like, what do people do when they're trying to recover from sexual violence? And I don't know, and I sort of followed this path. And by the time I got to the idea of porn, I was like, what if what if she could hear their voices? And then suddenly it was like everything kind of came together. And then I wrote a draft of it, and it was the first time that I felt like, as I was writing it, I was really excited, and I was like, I feel like this is right, this is good. Like I had this really, which I had never had that feeling before. I took it to a workshop, and people were like, we have some thoughts, but this is like really good. Like you seem like you're doing something here that like, is new and different, and your language is different, and everything is just really different. And it just really, I don't know, it was just this first moment where I felt like it was right. And then after that, I feel like that sort of sensation of like, I just got really sort of used to thinking about what I think of as like a narrative problem, like in this way, the way that like stories are problems that need to be solved. Sort of like, how do you tell a story about like, so like with especially heinous, like how do you tell a story about sexual violence, sort of cultural narratives of sexual violence. Like how do you do that? Or how do you write about like male entitlement, in the husband stitch. So like, I just sort of was kind of kicking stuff around, and it just became the way that I realized that was how my mind was sort of working.
Well, you've written a piece in The New Yorker about a writer whose novels were important to you growing up, those of Lois Duncan, which feels like a sort of a reverse phenomenon of this. So, some ways her life feels like an example. When we're talking about how can we bring realistic concerns into the uncanny. And yet it feels like for her, she actually believed that her uncanny writing was influencing the real world. Can you talk about what drew you to her, and about the blurring of fiction and life in her life? Yeah.
So Lois Duncan, she's probably most well known for the book I Know What You Did Last Summer, which was made into like a really famous film in like, I think 97. She... I just discovered her books like at the library. I don't even remember why I picked up one of them, but I just devoured them. And she wrote like thrillers, sort of supernatural thrillers for young people in the 60s and 70s was sort of her heyday. And the book that I read of hers, Gallows Hill, was like a new book, and as it turned out, ended up being the last fiction book that she published. So the tragedy in her life was that in like the late 80s, her daughter was murdered in a drive-by shooting, and the murderer was never found. And so, I was reading a bunch of her work, and then at some point I was looking up her name on the library computer to see if I had missed any books on the shelf. And there was one that was not with the fiction; it was in the nonfiction. And I went, and it was this book called "Who Killed My Daughter," and it was her sort of talking about the various conspiracies around who had murdered her daughter, and also she believed in things like. She was so like the cover of like the British edition of one of her books, the face, there was a man's face on it, and it looked like a suspect drawing. So she became sort of convinced that there was this sort of larger, like sort of supernatural thing kind of at work. And I didn't really know what to make. And I was young. I mean, I must have been 11, 12. And so I didn't understand how this book was in the nonfiction section. I didn't fully understand. And when I realized later what I was seeing was like this grief on like raw grief on display, which was like really alarming. And I don't think I fully understood like why it was so alarming, but I devoured this book, and there's also a sequel that came out a few years ago. And she passed away very recently, and I think very suddenly. But her work was really interesting to me because it was all about women and girls in peril, and it was like she had to write about that. That was a theme that sort of she returned to both before her daughter's death and after. And Yeah, I don't know. And I don't know. I feel like in some ways it's like she was dealing with these like very real sort of situations, but then with this sort of like supernatural sort of thriller element. And I think it was only when sort of writing that essay, when she died, I found myself very, I was surprisingly devastated by her death. Like I was not expecting that. I got very emotional about it, and then I wrote this essay, and I was really surprised by sort of when I was looking back over her books, and it was funny. I was like writing it, and I was sitting at my desk with like this big pile of like all her, which I still have, like all the books that I had read as a kid, because eventually I stopped checking the library. I just bought everyone, so I had this like giant pile next to me, and I was kind of going through them, and I was like really just like moved kind of all over again, and I was like, these books really hold up, and also like, her writing is really solid, and like, these stories are so eerie and beautiful, and I just really, really loved her work. Sorry, I like forgot what you asked me about the initial question.
No, you did great.
Okay, thanks.
So another one of your answers around women and the uncanny is also that being a woman is inherently uncanny. And you've said your humanity is liminal, your body is forfeit, your mind is doubted as a matter of course, you exist in the periphery. And that reminds me, this idea of one's mind is doubted as a matter of course, reminds me of one of my favorite analysis of your work, a review in Fiction Unbound by Theodore McCombs, where he both contextualizes the writing historically speaking and also suggests that the phenomenon of gaslighting is one lens through which you can read this whole collection. So I'm going to read a little excerpt, and then I just want to hear your thoughts on it. He says, Gothic literature is most often associated with its haunted spaces, the rotting castles, strange nocturnal noises in the next room, the draft of cold air that seems to come from nowhere, but in its purest form, in its first masterpieces like Anne Radcliffe's Mysteries of Udolpho, or later revisions like Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, the Gothic is dominated by the women within those spaces experiencing and resisting real peril, while never being entirely believed, not even by the male hero. It's the nightmare of patriarchy, before that concept was developed or mapped, an intuition that something is terribly wrong and dangerous without the confidence to scream for help. It's an atmosphere that Machado's stories draw upon and reassert in a contemporary world against a contemporary dread, because despite social changes since the 18th century, women still find themselves threatened and gaslighted, caught in a crazy-making duality of progress and regress, power and powerlessness, liberation and violence.
I'd forgotten about that quote, but I love it so much.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
But the way it's placing you in a tradition is fascinating. And I wondered if there was a revelation in reading that mirroring back to you, or where that was a place that you had oriented yourself in.
Yeah, it's funny because the first time I remember reading, I have this really clear memory of reading Jane Eyre. It was on some summer reading list when I was a kid. I must have been going into middle school, maybe going into high school. And I remember like it was summer. I took it out of the library. I was like sitting on the front porch, like eating a popsicle and like reading Jane Eyre, and was like so freaked out by it. And again, like, and it's sort of in that way where it's like, it's sort of this almost like pre-verbal, like people didn't really have the sort of like critical language or architecture to talk about things like patriarchy, but like it was reflecting this quality, right? And I've always been really interested in physical spaces. Like that is like when I wrote The Resident, which I'd argue is probably the most Gothic story in that collection, I was thinking both a lot about the physicality of the space, in that case, the space of the writing residency, and also like a place where the past kind of exists for this protagonist, and also a past exists for the space. And sort of her trying to come to terms with like questions about like, which questions are questions that I have about, mental illness, gender, sexuality, narratives about those things, like what our sort of priorities should be as artists. And that was just like a really important to sort of have those things kind of together. And it just made sense for that to be happening like at this writer's residency. I think, so I wrote an essay for Medium, like, I guess that was right at the end of 2017 about gaslighting. I was thinking a lot about it I was asked to write an essay about a word that defined 2017. And I was like, oh, I know exactly the word. The only word that I can think of to define it would be this gaslit or gaslighting. And I sort of rewatched Gaslight, the Ingrid Bergman version of Gaslight, to sort of prepare for the essay and to write it. And there's something about and in that essay, I was actually pretty pessimistic because the thing I kept returning to was like, the only reason she escaped from that situation is because there was like this, enterprising, young detective who was sort of like following her around and trying to like figure out what was going on. And if not for him, I mean, she probably would have just continued, right? She would have just died that way, sort of trapped in this like prison of her own mind that like this man had sort of put her in. So I was like, I don't know what happens to us. Like, how do we get out of this sort of like cultural gaslighting that like, about women? And I feel like things are always bad. They're particularly bad right now. And I feel like, we never quite, I keep saying this is I feel like it's kind of controversial, but like, I feel like regardless of how you feel about Hillary Clinton as a candidate, I feel like we never had like a national conversation about the way sexism played out in the election. And I think it was incredibly traumatic for women. And I think I don't think we even fully come to terms with like how traumatic it was. We never had like a deep, like a processing where we were like, what was that, and because we also obviously we automatically went into panic mode, like Trump is president, oh my God, and so I feel like that is like the ultimate, that's like part of that gaslighting, right? Where it's just like, oh, you saw like a powerful, successful, rich, wealthy white woman just get like destroyed by like this incompetent, this just that, I think what's really interesting about it is that it was all very like obvious and boorish. Like it was sexism that was so obvious that like if you put it in a short story, someone would be like, take that out, it's too obvious. Yeah. You know what I mean? And I think that's what was the most alarming about it, was it wasn't subtle at all. And we just sort of saw this woman with like all the power and privilege you can possibly imagine, except for her gender. And she still like had to go through the ringer and then ultimately like, lose. And people are still mad at her. Still, people are constantly like, well, let's talk about Hillary Clinton, and it's like, oh my God, like she's not president, and I feel like there's something about that that's really horrifying and extraordinary, but also just reflects like how I don't think we're able to kind of get out of this cycle. I think we're all sort of trapped in this sort of cultural gaslighting sort of gothic moment, and so I feel like, of course, my work reflects that because I feel like that's just I'm caught up in that just like everybody else.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because you make this, what I would call a brilliant move at the beginning of the book that sort of traps the reader in a certain superstructure that puts us in a position of being gaslit by this unspecified narrator. So the book opens with the story, The Husband Stitch, and immediately as we open the book and begin the story, we are addressed in a parenthetical by this unspecified narrator who tells us what voices we should assume when we read each of the characters as we read the story out loud. So the book immediately is announcing its strangeness, its uncanniness, it's breaking the fourth wall before the fourth wall has even been established. But it's also instructing us to read characters in this very culturally gendered way. The father's voice should be kind and booming, the son's gentle, the female protagonist's voice should be high-pitched and forgettable, and all the other women in the story should be read in the same way, interchangeably. So from the get-go, to enter the book, we are sort of complicit in a sexist superstructure. And simply by entering the world, we participate in rules that we didn't create. So there are many times in the book, I feel like you break the fourth wall, and we're aware of the maker of the story and of the teller of the story, and of the system of the story. And I was wondering if you were drawn to this for that effect, for this effect of where am I standing, and how by standing there am I participating in something unwittingly?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, yeah, and I do feel also as if I feel like there's also this sort of quality of it where we have to also acknowledge like our own complicity. I mean, I don't think enough is not said about like internalized sexism, right? So like in my own life, like I have found myself thinking things like, I wish I could be this, or I wish I could do this, and it's all sort of playing into this like idea about like who is powerful and who is smart and who, and it comes from that internalized sexism, right? And I think, I sort of like the idea of writing a story or a project where the reader is sort of complicit in that way, as we all are, right? And I always love a story that, when I'm reading, I love a story that like tangles me up in it in that way. Where like my sort of role as the reader is I'm trying to think of the way to say it. Yeah, like just I guess just me being tangled up in it as a reader, and so I kind of like the idea of tangling up my readers as well.
Yeah, Well, another thing that I really love about the opening story, The Husband Stitch, is the way it foregrounds the ways stories inform lives. The way we are born into stories of marriage, stories of desire, stories of happy families, stories of gender roles. All these stories are usually sort of in the background. They're sort of the white noise, the fabric of the culture that we live in. But here we are told in this story, story after story, that might at first feel tangential to the primary narrative, but they accumulate in a way that they feel like they become the foundation of the story. So I was hoping you could read two of them, and then we could talk about the story within the story effect. The American Girl in Paris and The Liver Story. So 18 and 19 and 23 and 24.
Of all the stories I know about mothers, this one is the most real. A young American girl is visiting Paris with her mother when the woman begins to feel ill. They decide to check into a hotel for a few days so the mother can rest, and the daughter calls for a doctor to assess her. After a brief examination, the doctor tells the daughter that all her mother needs is some medicine. He takes the daughter to a taxi, gives the driver instructions in French, and explains to the girl that the driver will take her to his residence, where his wife will give her the appropriate remedy. They drive and drive for a very long time, and when the girl arrives, she is frustrated by the unbearable slowness of the doctor's wife, who meticulously assembles the pills from powder. When she gets back into the taxi, the driver meanders down the streets, sometimes doubling back over the same avenue. Frustrated, the girl gets out of the taxi to return to the hotel on foot. When she finally arrives, the hotel clerk tells her that he has never seen her before. When she runs up to the room where her mother had been resting, she finds the walls a different color, the furnishings different than her memory, and her mother nowhere in sight. There are many endings to this story. In one of them, the girl is gloriously persistent and certain, renting a room nearby and staking out the hotel, eventually seducing a young man who works in the laundry and discovering the truth, that her mother had died of a highly contagious and fatal disease, departing this plane shortly after the daughter was sent from the hotel by the doctor. To avoid a citywide panic, the staff removed and buried her body, repainted and refurnished the room, and bribed all involved to deny they had ever met the pair. In another version of this story, the girl wanders the streets of Paris for years, believing she is mad, that she invented her mother and her life with her mother in her own diseased mind. The daughter stumbles from hotel to hotel, confused and grieving, though for whom she cannot say. Each time she is ejected from another posh lobby, she weeps for something lost. Her mother is dead, and she does not know it. She won't know it until she, herself, is also dead, assuming you believe in paradise. I don't need to tell you the moral of this story. I think you already know what it is. One of my favorite stories is about an old woman and her husband, a man mean as Mondays, who scared her with the violence of his temper and the shifting nature of his whims. She was only able to keep him satisfied with her cooking, to which he was a complete captive. One day he bought her a fat liver to cook for him, and she did, using herbs and broth. But the smell of her own artistry soon overtook her, and a few nibbles became a few bites, and soon the liver was gone. She had no money with which to purchase a second one, and she was terrified of her husband's reaction when she discovered that his meal was gone. So she crept to a church next door, where a woman had been recently laid to rest. She approached the shrouded figure, and then cut into it with a pair of kitchen shears, and stole the liver from her corpse. That night the woman's husband dabbed his lips with a napkin, and declared the meal the finest he'd ever eaten. When they went to sleep, the old woman heard the front door open, and a thin wail wafted through the rooms. "Who has my liver? Who has my liver?" The old woman could hear the voice coming closer and closer to the bedroom. There was a hush as the door swung open. The dead woman posed the query again. The old woman flung the blanket off her husband. "He has it," she declared triumphantly. Then she saw the face of the dead woman and recognized her own mouth and eyes. She looked down at her abdomen, remembering now how she carved into her own belly. She bled freely there in the bed, whispering something over and over as she died, something you and I will never be privy to. Next to her, as the blood seeped into the very heart of the mattress, her husband slumbered on. That may not be the version of the story you're familiar with, but I assure you it's the one you need to know.
We've been listening to Carmen Maria Machado read from Her Body and Other Parties. So tell us a little bit about the stories within the stories. The way I read it is slightly like the gaslighting phenomenon, in the sense, do we even realize what stories we're walking around in, at just being born into, essentially? But what are you doing here with these stories?
Right. So I think it's a couple of things. I'm really interested. I mean, I feel like, urban legends, sort of like fairy tales, reflect cultural ideas, cultural anxieties, and these stories, even the original versions of the stories, not the ones that I rewrote, reflect certain fears. So the woman with the liver, this idea that like a woman is so afraid of her husband that she will like go steal a liver from a corpse rather than tell him that it doesn't exist, or that that it's gone, or the fact that that she was not even allowed to like eat what she had made. That's like a very simple sort of like idea that is obviously like part of it, even though it's not really part of the horror of like the ending, which is the woman sort of crying out. And so that's part of it, certainly. And I think this idea that we don't really know what stories we're in, and I feel like there's something about the protagonist of this story tells a lot of these stories, but she herself is also in an urban legend, right? Or this sort of this folktale about the woman with the ribbon around her neck, and doesn't seem to necessarily know. She knows what will happen if the ribbon comes off, but she doesn't know that she is going to die. She doesn't realize that that's the ending of the story. And so, I feel like we do have this sort of blindness about the narratives that we are engaged in at all moments. And we are, right? Like we're always sort of engaging in some sort of cultural narrative. And it's really hard to sort of back up a little bit and be like, what am I doing right now? Like, what am I playing into? And so, I feel like these sort of like stories, and I also just always love like a nested narrative. I feel like that's a style that I've always really loved. And I feel like the way that characters tell stories tells us a lot about the characters themselves, And so
there was an interesting take on your collection by Nathan Goldman, where he talked about, or he contextualized your book around the idea of the intertextuality of fairy tales in general. So how fairy tales are often about the act of storytelling insofar as they are conspicuously in conversation with the stories that precede them. So they foreground, much like The Husband's Stitch does, the stories that inform them, rather than acting like they come out of a moment of individual genius. Does that ring true to you at all?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think it's funny, like the reason I wrote this story is because when I was a kid, I was a Girl Scout, and I did a lot of like campfire stories, and I had read, the Alvin Schwartz books, The Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, and also In a Dark, Dark Room, which is where the ribbon story comes from. And when I sort of returned to it as an adult, I mean, the thought process, like the reason I thought of it was I was like talking to some friends about those stories, and I was like, the one that always really fucks me up, the one that really haunts me is the green ribbon. And everyone else sort of they were like, oh, yeah, I remember that one. And everyone else also had a different response. Like I had a friend who there's a story from the Scary Stories book, and he was like, oh, there's one with the Wendigo, and there's like this scene where like the footprints are like getting longer. And like that was the one that like was sort of seared into his mind, And so I feel like, having that sense of like what stories, like for some reason when I was younger, the story with the ribbon, even before I had that language for patriarchy, before I had this sort of language for like the architecture of power, this very simple story about like a woman whose husband would never stop asking her about the ribbon and always wanted to untie the ribbon, and that she herself eventually was like, okay, fine, do it. Something that really haunted me and upset me even before I had any sense of like what larger sort of power structures that was reflecting.
Your dedication at the beginning it seems to be a counterbalance to this idea of how stories can be harmful, because you dedicate the book to your grandfather and to the stories that he told you. Can you talk a little bit about what was captivating about your grandfather's storytelling and what of it you see appearing in your own?
Yeah, so my grandfather is from Cuba, and until a few years ago, I had never been. I wasn't able to go for all the obvious reasons. And he would sort of tell us these stories about Cuba, and it was like stories that, and also stories about like his life that also when he came to the United States and he was in the Korean War. I mean, he told us a lot of stories, but and there was always this sort of this funny, like it was like these sort of dark stories, really beautifully and very humorously told. So like there was this one that I loved that I would ask him to tell over and over, and it basically was a story about how he had this pet rooster. I can't remember the rooster's name. I used to know it. And one day, and he was like eating soup and was like, "Where's my rooster?" And her mom was like, "Well, you're eating your rooster. Like your rooster's in the soup." And he would tell that story humorously, right? Even though like undoubtedly that's like an incredibly traumatic thing for a child to hear. And then it was really interesting when I went to Cuba with my brother. We were sort of walking around Santa Clara, where he's from, and like we were seeing these places that had like settings of. Like, the settings of the stories that we had heard for so long. And so I feel like, his stories always had this sort of arch sense of humor while also talking about really dark things, and he went from Cuba to Tennessee, and, he was like a dark-skinned, Spanish-speaking Cuban immigrant in Tennessee in like 1950 something. And experienced like horrific like racism, but he would tell these stories in these really funny ways where he was sort of acknowledging the darkness while also sort of giving the stories this kind of levity. And I think that it's funny because people will ask me sort of like, the stories have a lot of humor in them, even though they're like about really dark topics. And it's like, yeah, I feel like that's kind of the only way to do it. And I definitely credit, again, that sort of that sensibility that I think he just, I don't think it was like, it wasn't conscious. Like, it wasn't like, he's like, here's how you tell a good story. Like, I just sort of understood that was part of it, that like life was sort of this, like these dark, horrific things. And it also was funny. It was funny how dark things were. And I think that sort of sensibility really just sort of was like in me. I was actually, I was doing another interview before this, and I was telling a story about how I had written this story as a child called The Biggest Turkey Can't Find the Farm. And the basic plot of it was that like this turkey is lost and trying to get home, and he's going to different places, and he's never where he's supposed to be. And then finally he gets to the farm, and he says, "Is this it? Yay! Like, I'm home." And then the last page was like a roasted turkey on a plate, and it said like, "I wish I did not come here."
Oh no.
And my parents were like, "What is this thing you wrote?" And I mean, clearly I'd gotten that sort of, that's like the sort of ironic turn, at the end, and like the sort of the darkness and the humor of that, the pathos of that sort of scenario, and I was like 6 or something, I was like really, really young, but I had just sort of like figured that out. And I think that sort of comes from that. So yeah, my grandfather, and now, he's still alive, but he has pretty severe dementia, and the only real thing, we visit him, like my brother and I will sit there and be like, "Tell us a story about this." And like when he'll sort of start to tell it, and then he'll sort of stop. We'll be like, "Well, didn't this happen next?" And because, at this point they're just like second nature to us, and we just sort of know them.
Wow.
So I mean, it seemed I had to dedicate the book to him. It felt wrong not to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In case you just tuned in, we're talking today to Carmen Maria Machado, the author of Her Body and Other Parties from Grey Wolf Press. Well, to pivot to something else that comes up in a lot of your interviews, you mentioned a book by Joanna Russ called How to Suppress Women's Writing. I'd like to hear about it a little bit if you don't mind. But before we do, I wanted to ask a question, a larger question, about the erasure of women's writing and in the canon, because this will be the third time in 7 years that I have this conversation. And the other 2 times were with Joe Walton and with Ursula K. Le Guin. And they're both science fiction fantasy writers. And so are you, as well as you're in both worlds, the science fiction fantasy and the literary world, if those it can be considered separate. But I wondered if that was coincidence in your mind. I wondered, or whether that was a sign of, or you thought that might be a sign of a heightened consciousness or curation or activism around what is in and not in the canon and the sci-fi fantasy world versus the non-sci-fi fantasy world?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I mean, certainly the science fiction and fantasy world and the literary world, they actually are distinctive communities, regardless of how you feel about like the work itself and the writing and how you identify like certain genres. But yeah, there definitely are these sort of distinct, almost like tracks, I guess you could call them. And yeah, I mean, the Joanna Russ, so How to Suppress Women's Writing, which is a book, I'm actually not surely, I don't fully understand what, it's sort of in and out of print at the same time. I think it's like a print on demand. I think it's like University of Texas Press or something. And it should be taught in literally every literature class ever, because it's this really like fundamental so basically Joanna Russ is saying like, it's a sort of this like tongue-in-cheek, almost like guide. Like here's how you keep women out of the larger narrative, and so it's sort of like she didn't write it is like one of the sort of steps of the book. So it's like this wasn't really written by this person. They assign it to like a male author, or she did write it, but it wasn't her. So it was like it was her hysteria, it was her femaleness. Like it wasn't like her mind. It was or she did write it, but look what she wrote about. She wrote about the home. She wrote about domestic matters, so it's not important. It's not real literature, et cetera. And so she sort of goes through this sort of multi-step process and is also like it's an exhaustively referenced book. So there's just like footnotes and notes and just like, she sort of just, she was a really brilliant critic. And like from when the book was, she's not alive anymore, but it was this, as of when she had written it, it was like this really exhaustively sort of researched and cited book. So I don't really know. I feel like I don't even know if it's even about like the literary versus the genre world. I just think that generally speaking, and there are always exceptions, right? There's always, of course, there are like, you can name like famous examples of like highly read like women writers, but I do feel like there's this, what we consider sort of serious literature or what we consider, who gets to write about things like marriages or, who gets to, and like how that work is sort of treated, what book covers look like, is like a really basic, it's funny. There was this tremendous novel I just read from the 70s by Anne Rivers Seddons called The House Next Door. I had read it because Stephen King had recommended it as like one of his favorite haunted house novels. And I'm on like a haunted house kick right now. So I picked it up and it was amazing. It was terrifying. I read it in one sitting.
What's it called again? The
House Next Door.
Okay.
Like written, I think it was like the early 70s. And what's amazing is I picked up a copy I found, but like the cover, it's like this like kind of pastel. It looks like just looks like not even you would never begin to realize what kind of book it was by looking at the cover, which is not to say that cover isn't bad. It doesn't match what's in it, but it does match a certain, she's like this Southern writer. Like there's this, she's a woman, so she must have this like very sweet pastel sort of cover that in no way belies what's like inside of the book. And so stuff like, so that those are all, sort of, I feel like this is all sort of ways in which, I don't know. And it's funny because it's like women are tremendous readers and women like do write a lot, but we just like, we don't want to take them seriously. And, the way we think about like awards and whose work is sort of worth that kind of critical attention. I think it's really awful and very frustrating. And like, I had written about it recently in Electric Literature because I had noticed, I had read the new Shirley Jackson biography that came out, I guess it was like a little over a year ago at this point. And I had observed that on the back of the book, Neil Gaiman had blurbed the biography and he had referenced the Joanna Russ book kind of, but like hadn't cited it and also had sort of bastardized the phrase. So like it I don't remember, I don't have it in front of me. I don't remember exactly what the quote was, but like he basically, and it was weird because it was like, even though he was like praising this book, he was praising sort of like the fact that this book was like, is trying to elevate Shirley Jackson where she belongs in the American canon because she's like one of our sort of finest like 20th century writers. Even in that process, he sort of like yanks Joanna Russ out of that sort of, that sort of like referential sort of process. And it was,
so like, if I understand correctly, he's sort of breaking a link.
Exactly.
While also doing something that's praiseworthy. So it's complicated.
Right, exactly. And, I felt, and I mean, obviously, like, it's wonderful that Neil Gaiman, like, gave this book that kind of attention. It's really lovely. But yeah, I found that I was really disturbed by it. Which is why I wrote this essay for Electric Literature about, and then I sort of revisited, the Joanna Russ book and was thinking about, like the fact that book should be taught in every literature class. And a lot of people do not know it even exists. Yeah. Right. And then it's like a crime. It's like this like fundamental critical book about like how we read women's writing and like what we do to women writers, and the fact that like that book is not on every shelf and in every school and is being taught constantly is just like it's an absolute crime. And that made what he did feel even more egregious, even if it was again totally unintentional. And that's sort of what made it so awful. Was it wasn't as if he was like there was like this, it wasn't like a Snidely Whiplash, right? Or is that his name? Like twirling his mustache and like tying a damn, it was like, right. It was just an act of sort of carelessness, but honestly, like, that's all it takes, right?
Yeah.
To break a link is an act of carelessness.
Well, that's interesting about the links and this, and you also mentioned the importance of Russ's endnotes and citations in the book, because there's this interesting piece on Tor by Britt Mondello about the endnotes,
which I reference in the essay. It's tremendous. It's a really, really good
about
essay.
the history, creating history through the act of listing. And she says the history of women writers as friends, as colleagues, as individuals, as a group is written on sand. Each generation feels that they're the first. Feminist history is in a state of perpetual erasure, but Russ creates a history and a set of possibilities not written in sand. And what's interesting about that to me, other than in and of itself, is this issue of listing creating links, because you also are a lover of lists and of using and of using lists as a narrative structure. This is true in your story Inventory, even more so in Especially Heinous 272 Views of Law and Order SVU, which is organized as consecutive TV listings reimagining episodes. But it's also true in a lot of essays and stories not in the collection. How to Almost Probably Not Die of Rabies, How I Should Have Known Trump Would Be Elected President, and Selected Objects from the Estate Sale of Mercedes Pilar Machado. So how are lists operating for you, if that can be answered? And what is drawing you in the first place to lists?
I feel like lists for me are sort of that thing where, you know, every writer has a thing that's both their greatest weakness and their greatest strength at the same time. And I feel like lists are that for me, and that I love them. And some people really, I feel like I see a lot of people being like, can't you just write a thing without a list? You know? But I don't know. I've always found lists to be really fascinating because I think of them as sort of like a scatter plot graph, right? Where like you have these points of data, and a narrative is like the sort of the line. This is like as much math as I can remember from school, but like, you know, it's like there's like a best fit line that kind of goes in between that reflects the sort of the averaging of all these like data points, and that's like sort of the narrative, or like the sort of the heart of the story. And so like that was sort of when I was thinking about the structure of Especially Heinous, which is that, but on a massive scale, right? Because all these lists, you know, the lists are, and also like in Mothers is a huge list, right? With in the kitchen, in the house that she's sort of imagining. Like I use them a lot, but obviously Especially Heinous is like that times 1,000, right? Because it's so long. But yeah, so I like to sort of think about like how objects and ideas can sort of serve as these little like, or it's like a constellation, right? Where it's like there's just little points of data, and then our sort of understanding of like an emotional state, or our understanding of the way a story should be read, is sort of that best fit line that goes through all those pieces of information. And sometimes it's like a plot, and sometimes it's a little more emotional than that, where it's like, you know, if I mean, this is like a very obvious example, but like whenever I talk about lists with my students, I'll say, okay, so like here's a shopping list, and I'll start to like make a shopping list on the board. And first it's like tissues, ice cream, you know, rent, some romantic comedy. And I'm like, what is this list? And they're like, oh, someone got broken up with. And it's like, right, okay, right, simple. And then I'm like, okay, then I add like shotgun, shovel, lie, tarp. And I'm like, now what is this story? They're like, oh, someone broke up with them and they were about to go like murder them, right? And so like the story is just changing. And that's, again, like a very obvious and very like using a lot of stereotypes, right? But still it's like you can sort of see the story sort of evolving and moving through those data points. And so, yeah, so I just feel like it's just a form that for me, it feels very natural. I like it. I guess I could definitely see somebody arguing that it's a crutch that I fall back on. Like it's a thing that I know I can do it well. So I like to do it when I don't know what else to do, which I think would be a very fair critique. But yeah, I don't know. I don't really know where it came from. Like, I don't know like what the sort of, like what the first thing I did was that I felt that way about it, but but I like it. I don't know.
Well, I want to ask you it in relationship to photography, because you studied photography as an undergraduate, and there's something that you said about photography that makes me feel like it applies to your list stories. So let me see if you think the same. So you said, I like to use the real to access the unreal, the foreground as a frame for the background, and the unreal to access the real, the background as a frame for the foreground. And this feels true like in a story like Inventory, where on the surface we're getting a list of sexual encounters. But over the course of the character's life, it feels like in the background we're getting the world building, and we're realizing what's really going on. So can you talk a little bit about maybe that, the background foregrounding of world building when presenting a list?
Yeah, so it's funny because I studied still photography. I didn't really study. I took some film classes, but that was not my focus. In retrospect, if I could like go back to you're like, if I could go back to college, here's what I would study. I would have studied film, because I feel like what really interests me about, I'm really interested in like various mediums, how each of them can sort of do certain things. So like fiction can do things that film can't do, but film can do things that photography can't do. There's like different sort of strengths to each form. And with cinema, like one of my favorite movies in the world is Children of Men, and every time I rewatch that movie, and I've watched it, I couldn't even tell you how many times at this point, I see new stuff in the background. And it's a story where like you're seeing this very immediate sort of thing right in front of you, but if you sort of just shift your own, almost like imagine like a camera like changing depth of field, like if you shift your focus a little bit, you can see all the other stuff happening in the background, and it's actually telling you a ton about both like literally what's sort of happening in this world, and also like this sort of really intense like emotional state of like this sort of near future state of chaos, right? And I'm also really interested in the fact that in film, like you can, like something can be happening on one side of the screen, but if you just look at a different part of the screen, other things are happening that you may or may not be paying attention to. And unlike with fiction, you can choose to sort of move your focus in that way, right? Because like fiction, it's like you're just reading the words on the page, in traditionally structured fiction in any case. But like with a movie, you can sort of just be like, so like a game I play with myself. So I really hate The Big Bang Theory. It's infuriating to me. Everyone in my family loves it. So I sort of often find myself in front of a television where that show is playing, and I'm like real mad about it. So the game that I play with myself to just like keep myself occupied and not like fly into a horrible rage is whenever somebody's talking on the screen, I'll just look at the other actors who are not speaking in the scene or who are like not speaking at that moment, because their faces are always really funny, because their faces are really relaxed because they're not getting ready to speak. So they're just sort of like looking in weird places, or they're just sort of like, they're just in this like weird slack, like performing state, because they're not having the conversation at that moment. And I'm always sort of, and it's like, I'm not supposed to look at that. Like I'm supposed to be looking at this like other conversation that's happening, but there's something really fascinating about like this other sort of like weird little sub narrative that's happening. And there's a really good, a writer I really love, Bennett Sims, who I went to college with. He's this really tremendous. Have you read his work?
I haven't.
So he had a novel come out a couple of years ago called Questionable Shape with $2 Radio, and then he just had a story collection come out this past fall called White Dialogues, also with $2 Radio. And I've been waiting for White Dialogues to be a book for so long, because his short stories are, I mean, his novel is amazing also, but his short stories are like my absolute favorite. And he has this really tremendous story that was published in Electric Literature that is told in the form of a lecture about, I think it's Vertigo. It's like some Hitchcock film. And the protagonist is making this argument that there's like these what he calls the story is called White Dialogues. There's these like, the extras are talking in the background, and that you can sort of interpret. There's like this whole second film that's happening without the characters. Sorry, this is like a long explanation. That like is happening with the extras that are like speaking, right? And that there's like this other film happening in the background. And it's a really amazing story. And also I feel like it kind of gets at this like fascinating thing about cinema. And it's like a short story about that phenomenon. Though the Electric Literature one actually had GIFs, like they put GIFs up of these moments. So there was a visual component in the online version of the story. But in any case, so there's something about that quality of film that's really fascinating to me. And I'm really interested in, with Inventory as an example of me trying to sort of like borrow from that structure as much as I possibly could with like prose, and seeing how to write. So you have these like two sort of competing foregrounded and backgrounded stories, and how do you sort of make them work with each other and off of each other.
Well, there's also the tension when you're doing a repetition, so repeated sexual encounters, which are sort of like a list. We sort of get lulled into an idea. We know what's going on, but then the little details that keep changing behind that
exactly
make us feel like, oh no, we definitely don't know what's going on.
Exactly. And I feel like there's something about there's something really I've always loved. Like I feel this happens with video games. Like there was this really amazing game a couple of years ago called PT, and it was like this sort of short horror. I don't know if you play. It was this short horror game, and you seemingly are simply cycling through this like creepy hallway over and over again, but things are slowly sort of changing around you. And I feel like that there's something about that like unsettling detail where like things are slowly moving, but it's like the details are changing very, very slightly, but at some point you figure out the pattern of like what's happening. You figure out the pattern of what's happening, and then suddenly it creates this like anxiety, and it's like a horror game, or this like what is happening, or suddenly you're like paying attention to a new element of the story. So I'm just like fascinated by this sort of structural stuff, and I feel like the list work is me just like trying to do that.
Yeah. I want to pivot to something that's central to the collection that we haven't yet touched on, which is bodies.
Oh, right.
The title of the collection, Her Body and Other Parties, promises and delivers on the idea of engaging with bodies in nearly every story. Paradoxically, in the story, real women have bodies. We engage with the erasure and invisibility of women. But throughout much of the collection, we get stories that are very much rooted in the physical. The embodiment of sexual experience, lots of sexual fluids and secretions, lots of swollen, engorged, and aroused organs, male and female, plots driven by urges and desires. And you talked once about the books of Nicholas Baker, Vox and House of Holes, and Philip Roth's Sabbath Theater. And it was hard for you to think of women writers who wrote sex that way, sex that is explicit, potentially uncomfortable or disturbing, and that isn't being labeled or dismissed as erotica or romance because it's written by a woman, and that you wanted to bring that into your stories. So can you talk about the considerations and desires with regards to sex writing and the writing of bodies with this sort of ethical underpinning or this aesthetic underpinning?
Right. Yeah. So Nicholas and Baker is one of my favorite. I just love him. And his sex writing is probably one of the only examples of like straight white dudes writing sex that I actually like. And I feel there's something very like generous and tender about the way he writes sex that I don't feel that way with like Philip Roth. Like Philip Roth, I won't go too much into it, but I do feel like there's a sort of contempt at this core of Sabbath Theater is like an interesting book, and there is like a woman with sort of sexual agency in that book, which is but I feel like when I read it, I don't know. There's something just very discerning about the way he writes sex that I don't love, but. So I don't know. I mean, I just was really interested in. I feel like every person whose body is sort of at the center of various intersections of oppression, which sounds so like clinical, but like I'm a fat woman, I'm queer, like I'm sort of a mixed ethnic background and like am sort of white presenting-ish, but also not white exactly. And there's like this sort of, I feel like I think about bodies a lot, and I think about like my own sort of position and role in it. And like the fact that like, I feel like there's this very sort of privileged, specifically sort of male perspective of like the pure intellect, like, oh, you are just a mind. And it's like, no one is just a mind. Like brains are in bodies. There's no such thing as a brain in a jar. Like, you are filtered, your experiences, your life, your thoughts, your everything you think is filtered through your body. And I think people like I think a lot of times, like, especially like straight white men think themselves as like this sort of default, like we're just like this pure glass vessels and like, did they just bear, but it's like, no, like you still are, you are still the filter for that, right? And so, I was just really sort of hungry for certain kinds of narratives that I wasn't getting. Like I read Nicholas and Baker and I loved him, and I was like, I just wish I was reading more women that were writing this way. And there certainly are some, like, I mean, there are, Alyssa Netting is a really good example. I know like someone was just telling me about Allie Smith, who actually I have not read, but I'm really excited too. And was saying that Allie Smith's the writer who does this. There are some certainly, but I just was thinking about, sort of like these writers like relative profiles compared to like someone like Philip Roth. And I was like, interesting, again, like what kind of stories do we value? Whose bodily stories do we value? Like what kinds of masturbation scenes do we value? What kinds of sex scenes do we value? And I don't know. And I just wanted to do it. And I was like, I guess if no one stops me, I'll just keep going, And so I wrote inventory. I remember writing inventory and being like, can I do this? Like, can I write a story that is like literally entirely sex scenes? I guess I can. And somebody will publish it and John published it. And then I was like, oh, okay. So I don't know, it's just like a thing that really interests me. And I think I just really wanted, that to be able to occupy that space because I'm a person who thinks about those things. So like, why would I not?
Yeah.
Like, why would I not do that?
Well, you This is a total aside, but I just have to ask this because I can't remember entirely what you said. But you tweeted, I think yesterday, you were just at the Tin House Winter Writers Workshop, some writing advice from Dorothy Allison that had to do with masturbation. So what was that?
Yes. Oh my God bless Dorothy Allison. I love her so much. She was talking, basically she was saying that it's easier to write if you like learn how to masturbate. Which I think is sort of a beautiful idea. And I think, has a lot to do with actually I think it's like half like sort of self-care, just like taking care of yourself in that way. But also this idea of writing is about sort of pursuing what you want, right? And like what's sort of inside of you. And I feel like, in that way that like masturbation is about learning like what your body needs and what your body wants and like what brings you pleasure and what makes you happy and like what gets you to where you want to go. And I feel like those things are actually incredibly similar. And I had just never thought of it that way. And then she said it and I just like cracked up and I was like, God, that's so smart. I love that so much. Yeah. So I do, I feel like there's something very interesting and important. And also just the idea that like women's bodies and secretions and menstruation and childbirth and sex are things that are like worthy of and queer sex are like worthy of literary attention. They are worthy of, beautiful sentences, and they're worthy of like, good reviews, and they're worthy of prizes. Like those things are really important. It's not just like, dudes like being like, like there's like other things that are worthy of that kind of attention. And that's really important to me. And I'm really grateful that like I was able to write a book that then got the kind of attention that I think I was like, good, I'm glad that you think that queer sex is worthy of attention and that women's bodies are worthy of that kind of attention.
Well, and you mentioned also body size. So this book deals with the embodiment of different sexual orientations, but it also deals with body size. So we have the ghosts of girls who are literally sewn into prom dresses in one story. And then we have 8 Bites, which centers around a character's bariatric surgery to become skinnier, but how the removed fat takes on a haunted life of its own. And you've also written some really, I think, incredible essays on the topic. Perhaps most notably, The Trash Heap is Spoken, which I hope people will go seek out. Can you talk about Marjorie, the trash heap on Fraggle Rock, and how you use this character to explore large women in this piece, and in a greater sense, also how you use that to explore it in the collection?
Yeah, so I'm one of those. I'm a really slow essay writer. I can write short stories relatively quickly, but essays take me 5 times as long. I write like roughly 1 essay a year, and I've been trying to write an essay about fatness for a really long time. It's the thing I think about a lot. I'm a fat woman. Like, it's something that's very interesting to me. And I had started a lot of things, and none of them were satisfying. None of them I liked. They all felt sort of saccharine and sort of obvious. And, I feel like a lot of what I read about fatness is very just like, rah, rah, you go, girl, and which is like, I'm super into that. That's also great. But I feel like fat writing, there's a kind of dimensionality that I wanted to fat writing, which I think is happening. I think writers like Lindy West, Roxane Gay, like there are people who are writing about fatness in ways that are super interesting. But I just wasn't, I wasn't finding really what I wanted, and I was really struggling to write this essay. And it took me writing 8 Bites to kind of, oftentimes like I'll write a fiction story, and then it sort of gets me to the other side, and then I'm able to write an essay. So something about writing 8 Bites where, I had the permission to like be fantastical and just sort of like make stuff up and just sort of, be a fiction writer, gave me permission and space to then think about bodies in a way that was, had this sort of essayistic quality. But I still sort of, engage various fictional characters in this essay, including Marjorie the Trash Heap from Fraggle Rock, which actually was like, I forget why, but I was watching a clip of Fraggle Rock on YouTube, and I saw Marjorie, who I hadn't thought about in a really long time, and I was like, oh my God. I was like, she's like this beautiful, like obese character that is like noble and wise and funny and sassy and like sings these like really bluesy fun songs and is just like badass and like has these like cat-eyed glasses on a lorgnette and is like just amazing in like every way. And I had just never, I just had never thought about that way. And then I was thinking about like Ursula, who's like another fictional character who I'm really interested in sort of her portrayal, and it's funny because like, this happened after the essay came out, but like recently Disney did some like new promotional stuff, I think at the parks, and like they made like basically a skinny version of Ursula. Like they made Ursula skinny. And it's like why would you do that? Like literally like and so I sort of wrote about like using these fictional characters, thinking about like fat excellence, like what it means. Because, we think of, fatness is often used as this sort of shorthand for like laziness and stupidity. And, it's like people cannot escape their bodies. Like, actually, literally right before I got here, I was reading an essay in the car over. Someone written about like fat characters in video games, and they were talking about like some fat character who like it was like a villain who was fat, and then like when if you killed her successfully, she would like vomit and then like be crushed beneath like a wheelie cart or like a motor scooter or whatever. And there's like sort of the history of like fat characters in video games, and which was like fascinating. And so like I feel like there's something about. I was just really interested in sort of thinking about like what are examples of like fictional characters that reflect like a different sort of way of thinking about fat bodies. And I also sort of talk about like, I think about space taking is also part of it, like this political act. So like, we talk about things like manspreading, right? Which is like men taking up like physical space that they don't need to just because they feel entitled to the space, and how women sort of shrink themselves and kind of pull into themselves and don't want to take up that space. And it's like fatness is that, but like not even like an act of like making your body sort of like tightening up or whatever, but it actually like your body is fat, like you're taking up, like you're displacing more space than a non-fat person, and that is like a political act in its own way.
Well, you have this great line: unapologetic fat women embrace the philosophy of displacement. This is not just fatness of the body, it is fatness of the mind. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. I mean, I think I really it was really, I'm one of those people who like I writing helps me figure out my own thoughts, which is why I like writing essays. Like it helps me kind of organize my thoughts. But, and so I feel like as I was writing that essay, I could feel sort of all this stuff kind of falling into place that I've been thinking about a lot, that suddenly I had this like architecture to kind of stick it into. And the idea like the fat mind. And I mean, even in that, even in that also same essay, I talk about how like there was this quote in the Shirley Jackson biography that I was talking about earlier. It was like a quote from a friend of Shirley Jackson's, and Shirley Jackson was like a fat woman, and like the quote was so awful because it was like someone being like, oh yes, like she was so fat and she would like sit on the couch and take up half the couch, but she was so brilliant and charming and funny. Like how are those things in any way related to each other? Like she was brilliant and charming and funny, and they're like, but also she was fat, but like don't worry, she was brilliant and charming and funny. And and I feel like that sort of unthinking, like that just sort of this like we have this really sort of like demented relationship with like bodies and food and weight, and I feel like that's like a very basic reflection of that.
Well, you're just that disconnect there. You talk about an exercise that you do of imagining the shows that you really love, but the main character being fat instead of skinny, which points to all the roles that that people never imagine a fat person could inhabit in a show. So like, what are some of those things that you never see that makes you have to imagine transforming a skinnier character into a larger character?
I mean, I think it's partially the fact that we don't like you like if a character is fat, very often it's like used as sort of a shorthand for some quality of them. So like they're stupid, again, they're lazy.
So they're not complex.
Right. They're very simple. Or like, it's funny. So we do this thing at my house. My wife and I do this thing called Nostalgia Movie Night, where we have friends over twice a month and we watch movies from like our own childhoods. And it's delightful in many ways, but the fat phobia, among other many, like racism, among a lot of other problems for like films of the 90s, the fat phobia is the sort of fat panic is like very, very intense. And like we recently rewatched a movie I had not seen in a long time, which was Now and Then, and it was one of those things where like each girl in this group gets this like really complicated, intense like backstory about this like summer that like changed their lives and like all this stuff happening to them, except for the fat girl. The fat girl has no interiority. She has no. We don't see her like going through any. She's just sort of like tagging along and like doing things, and she just has. It's like she's not even a character. She's right. So she's the fat girl, and. Right, it sort of uses the shorthand, right, where it's like the sort of, so that's like really flat character where it's like all you need to know about them is they're fat, and that tells you everything you need to know about their personality. Yeah. You never see fat people as sexual or romantic leads. You never see characters where they're fat, and it's not commented upon, right? It's just like, this is a character who happens to be fat, and she just is, and that's just like part of who she is, and that's fine. And And so, yeah, that really, I find it very frustrating. And so, yeah, so I sort of engage. I'm like, just imagining, like, shows that I like that I, what if this character was fat or chubby or whatever? Like, what if she just looked different than she was? She wasn't skinny. In the same way that you might say, like, why are they straight? Why are they white? Why are they, you know what I mean? Like, you could do this with a lot of different things. But, yeah, I don't know. It just makes me really, and it's hard, or like, I remember, like, I watched Jessica Jones, which I loved. And literally in the first 10 minutes of that show, first episode, she's like spying. She's like spying. She's like looking for somebody. She's like on a fire escape, and she's like looking, and she just looks into a window of a woman's apartment. This woman is like on a treadmill eating a cheeseburger, like a fat woman on a treadmill, messily eating a cheeseburger. And the thing is that, and then she's like makes some like disparaging comment, and then sort of moves on. And it's like, okay, so that's like. Here we have a feminist show, like a show that like is about like entitlement and patriarchy. You have this scene where it isn't even about her personality, because the fact that like a fat woman is on a treadmill eating a cheeseburger, like no one fucking does that. No one is on a treadmill messily eating a McDonald's cheeseburger. That is ridiculous. That is not a thing that happens in real life. But so it wasn't even about like her own, like she's fat phobic. It's like the show's lens is fat phobic, right? And it's like, we can't imagine this character. You can't just be like a woman, just like, you could have just been like a woman like briskly running on a treadmill, I run on treadmills. Like, yeah. I assure you I'm not shoving a cheeseburger into my face while I'm doing it. I have like a water bottle, like every person who's running on a treadmill. And so like, it's just one of those things where it's like, and it was a gag. It was a throwaway gag. It had literally zero bearing on anything else in the show, and they just moved on. And I was like, are you joking? Like, are you kidding me? Or like right now, like I've been watching Brooklyn Nine-Nine. I had not seen it, and I was catching up, and I was looking for a new show, and someone recommended it, and I love it. It's super funny. It is so fat phobic. Like the fat characters in that show are just boorish, stupid, lazy, disgusting. They're eating constantly, and they're just dumb as rocks, And there's like one character who the trauma of his past is that he was fat once, and we constantly get these like humiliating, sort of throwback, what do you call it? Like flashbacks where he's like in a fat suit, and I'm just like, Jesus Christ, like what is the point of this? What do you like, and I think it's a problem of like, clearly you don't have any fat writers, which also is like its own thing, right? So you have this like I don't know, sorry. you've hit my like passion play. I'm like, what? No, people can't see, but I'm like waving my arms wildly around right now. So like recently there was this huge controversy with the Midwest Writers Workshop. Have you heard about this? So the Midwest Writers Workshop is this like, they run this like workshop in the Midwest. And there was this really amazing writer, Sarah Howell, who like is this brilliant writer who was also fat. And she was, I don't remember exactly, it's been a minute since I read about the details. Basically, like, they were going to elect her to the board, and a board member said, she's fat. We don't want her representing us because it's disgusting how fat she is. And a person with a conscience on the board told Sarah, was like, this is happening, and this is really disturbing. And so it was this huge thing. People wrote about it. It was just this really fucked up situation. They eventually, they voted to put Sarah, like, no, we're going to put her on the board. Don't worry about it. And then, the guy who ran apologized. And then 3 days later, they fired the woman who had said the thing. They were like, you basically, you ratted us out, and they fired her. Or a few years ago, there was an article in I think Entertainment Weekly or something about debut books that get huge advances. So a debut book from an unknown author who gets that gets $1 million advance. And there was this throwaway quote from an editor from a major publishing house where she was sort of talking about, I think it was Sweet Butter, or it was some book that they had gotten a really huge advance, and she was like, well, yes, it helps that she's young and pretty. But even if she'd been 500 pounds and really hard to look at, we probably would have given her the same offer. And again, just this throwaway line, as if it's and then Mallory Ortberg with this beautiful response in the Toast, where she was sort of people who are 500 pounds, they write, and they write tremendous and valuable things. And the idea that that is just, it's this person can't imagine a person who's 500 pounds, and then also they can't imagine this person would write anything worth reading. And the fact that just again, it's a throwaway line. It shows, I think, how that sort of that level of how demented that conversation is, where there's just this, it's just so, and it makes you crazy because also it's with with TV and film, it's you're there's this visual element which it still doesn't make any sense, but there's this visual element. But then with writing, it's
Well, that's what's so amazing about Roxane Gay, who's writing about weight, also explicitly touring about it and receiving over and over again these offensive scenarios keep happening to her by people who are purportedly interested in interviewing her about her book about her body size.
Yeah.
So it's like you would think that would be the last person who would, I mean, maybe naively think that would be the last person who would do that to Roxane Gay.
Right.
And yet we keep seeing this happening repeatedly.
Yeah, I would never suggest that it's like the last prejudice, because it definitely is not the last prejudice by any means, but it is definitely a sort of a pocket of oppression that is extremely unexamined. And I feel like we have not had a cultural reckoning or a cultural moment. I feel like we're still sort of engaging this like mass delusion about fatness, about in terms of like how we talk about fatness and like how we treat fat people. And, you know, I mean, there's like whole other dimensions to it. There's like medicine, right? I mean, which is like its own thing, like how fat people don't get the proper health care because like, you know, I mean, I could go on for like 10, I could just talk about this for 8 hours, but like, I feel like we just haven't had a reckoning in a way, like I'm trying to imagine like what would a Me Too movement about fatness look like? And I don't really know what it would look like, and I don't know if when or if we'll have that movement, but I'm really interested in it. But anyway.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, sorry. No, I was like really, I did not realize that was going to be like a Lance Boyle.
You have, to pivot a little bit, you have one reviewer that called the collection, or said that the collection queered reality. And it's true that your female protagonists are attracted to both women and men, some of them to both. The stories move fluidly between heterosexual and queer relationships. Without belaboring it, I'll say, like, when you say, like, wouldn't it be nice to have a fat character and it's not drawn attention to? I feel like it's not belabored in the book. It's just happening in the book. I did wonder if this comes from a sense of absence in what you've seen represented in literature. But it also made me think that this collection didn't just queer reality, which I do think it does, but that in a way it is asserting that reality itself is pretty queer, both in the broader and narrower senses of the word queer, that if we can get behind or beyond the narrator's demand at the beginning of your book to read the voices in a certain way, that there's a lot less stability in what we might see.
Well, I mean, I feel like it's sort of that quality of, I guess, liminality, which is a word that I use like probably too much, because I feel like I'm really interested in that space. You know, my characters, like I wanted to write a book where characters were queer and it wasn't like a thing, you know, which is not to say that like, you know, obviously like coming out stories and stories where queerness or questions of sexuality are important are obviously also very important and will always be important. But that was not what I was interested in writing. I really wanted to just talk about what it was like to just sort of be like, these are desires that I have and they are just what they are. And I'm not really going to have to like comment on them because they are, you know, and sometimes they'll work, sometimes they won't. The relationships themselves are more important than like that sort of angst or anxiety. And yeah, I feel like that's sort of that sense of liminality. That's really important to me. It's funny. I love the word queer. I occasionally find myself using the word queer in the very old fashioned sense, like, oh, what a queer sensation, or like what a queer, and I kind of wish I like want it to come back because I feel like it actually gets at this very like interesting sort of space that like the meanings of those words kind of overlap in this really interesting way.
Well, like when
that I think is fascinating. So
well, you mentioned earlier your nightmare story in an artist residency, which I was preparing for this interview in an artist residency and reading this artist residency story. So that was doubly so. But you do, one of the characters brings up Victor Slavsky's idea of defamiliarization, which does feel like it's partly connected to that older idea of queer.
Yeah.
And I was hoping you could read this section that the way things that are very commonplace can all of a sudden take on a strangeness.
Yeah. I was reminded for the umpteenth time of Victor Schlotsky's idea of defamiliarization, of zooming in so close to something and observing it so slowly that it begins to warp and change and acquire new meaning. When I'd first begun to experience this phenomenon, I'd been too young to understand what it was, certainly too young to consult a reference book. The first time, I lay down on the floor, examining the metal and rubber foot of our family refrigerator, wreathed in dust and human hair, and from this reference point, all other objects began to change. The foot, instead of being insignificant, one of four, etc., suddenly became everything, a stoic little house at the base of a large mountain, from which could see a tiny curl of smoke and glinting, illuminated windows, a home from which a hero would emerge eventually. Every nick on the foot was a balcony or a door. The detritus beneath the fridge became a wrecked, ravaged landscape, the expanse of kitchen tile a rambling kingdom, waiting for salvation. This was how my mother found me, staring at the foot of the refrigerator, so intensely my eyes were slightly crossed, my body curled up, my lips moving almost imperceptibly.
We've been listening to Carmen Maria Machado read from Her Body and Other Parties. So while we're on the topic of strange, I just wanted to briefly mention the ways in which you're enamored with unusual forms. So for Granta, you were asked to pick the best book of 1998, and you picked Jeff Ryman's hyperlink novel 253. And you have a piece in the Los Angeles Review of Books called Why Alice Munro Should Play Gone Home. Gone Home being a video game that you call the best story of the past summer. And you also have a hyperlink story, the morals of the stories, that comes with a warning about where the various links might lead. So could you just briefly touch on maybe some of these other forms that we see you excited about?
Yeah. So 253 is really interesting to me, which I also write about in the LA Review of Books essay. So I should back up. So Gone Home is this video game that came out a couple of years ago, which is basically sort of a click and point game where you are a college student returned. It's like the 90s. You've returned home from being abroad. You go to the house where your parents and your sister live, the house they've moved to since you left for college, and nobody is home. And you're sort of trying to figure out like where everybody is. And you sort of move through the house in this way, clicking on sort of objects and artifacts and trying to sort of discern the narrative from it. And it was a tremendous accomplishment. I absolutely love it. I could talk about that for another 8 hours, right? But I was really interested because I don't have the quote in front of me, but there was a really great quote about Alice Munro about how like being in writing a story is sort of like being in a house, and there's like these sort of elements of the house that you sort of move through, right? And this was like actually a literal house where like you as a character are like moving through, and in many ways, like the way, even though, so it's basically an interactive novel, right? And like just the order of information you got by picking up certain objects in a certain order, which was more or less up to you. And then with 253, which is this Jeff Ryman novel, which is about a train, a fictionalized crash in the tube in London, which he wrote, and it's set on the date when he discovered a friend of his who had AIDS was about to die, And so the original version of the novel was a hyperlink novel, which I had not. I read the print version first, but so the hyperlink version, it's like just sort of laid out like this train, and each section, and there's 253 passengers on the train, and each section is a 253-word description of like the exterior and interior of these people who are on this train in the 7 minutes before it crashes.
Wow.
So when you look at the hyperlink novel, it's like they're sort of visually laid out, and you can just click on you can just sort of click through sort of however you want. And then when you read the print version, you are just sort of going from front to back. And so you don't really have a choice. I mean, I guess you could skip around theoretically, but like it's sort of meant to just read straight through. And the effect is really different. It's like weirdly different because it's sort of this more like almost like this, it kind of gathers steam, no pun intended, in this like really intense way, and it's going faster and faster, and you're sort of moving through it in this really interesting way. And as you get closer to the back of the train, reality starts to bend. So like, you start off with like just these like people just going to work or people sort of doing various things. And then toward the end, you get like Anne Frank, who in this version of the story like has survived and is like living in London and is just like on the back of the train, and like are also other sort of like weird characters and figures that appear. And it's really beautiful in the way that it's sort of laid out. And so like when I look at this book, I mean, obviously the hyperlink version is fascinating to me, but I feel like the print version is like a little more satisfying, and I sort of prefer it. With Gone Home, I was really interested in how the fact that like the way that you can pick objects and what you can sort of leave behind or miss could change the way that you read the story. Similarly with the hyperlink version of 253, where like if you miss certain things, like you would just not read it in quite the same way. And that idea of like how the reader is sort of actually an active part of that process.
Well, speaking of houses as stories, your next book is House of Indiana, right? Coming out next year. Can you talk a little bit about it? You've called it an experimental memoir.
Yes.
And I would love to hear, maybe since we're talking about experiments and you've mentioned a variety of things you're interested in, can you talk a little bit about what we might expect?
Yeah, so it's a memoir about abuse and same-sex relationships, and it sort of uses this house and as a sort of a metaphor. I'm like very interested in haunted houses right now. This is just like a thing that I'm on a real kick about houses and spaces like that right now. So I sort of use various like genre tropes and ideas, including that of the house and the haunted house, to sort of examine sort of facets of this relationship. And I do a lot of other stuff. I like do a close reading of the Ingrid Bergman film Gaslight, and I do a lot of different stuff. So I think I was just sort of trying to figure out. I just sort of use the house as the metaphor. So this is just like a metaphor that, for some reason, is like sort of lodged in my brain, and I can't escape. And I've been really interested in.
Well, I can't wait for that one.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks so much for being on Between the Covers today.
Of course, it was my pleasure. Thank you.
We are talking today to Carmen Maria Machado, the author of Her Body and Other Parties from Grey Wolf Press. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the studios of KBOO, volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength community radio from Portland, Oregon, found at kboo.fm. More of Carmen Maria Machado's work can be found at carmenmariamachado.com, as well as the bonus material, Miss Laura's School for Esquire Men, and How I Should Have Known Trump Would Be Elected President at the Between the Covers Patreon page at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. And finally, I'd like to thank Imre Lodbrog and Barbara Browning for creating this outro. Their album, Imre Lodbrog et sa petite amie, can be found on iTunes, and Barbara Browning's trove of ukulele covers can be found at soundcloud.com/Barbara Browning.
This is Ursula K. Le Guin, and you are listening to KBOO, the cheerful voice of social conscience, KBOO in Portland.